Hi everyone. Now that you're familiar with calculating the internal rate of return of a real estate investment, I would like to show you something useful we can do with that IRR for the purpose of analyzing a real estate investment. Recall from your reading notes that the simple holding period return can be broken out into two components, yield and growth. In a similar manner, the IRR can often be usefully broken out into the following three components: initial yield, cash flow change, and yield change. This process is referred to as IRR performance attribution, or parsing the IRR into components that are approximately additive. You can think of the three components or attributes like the sources or causes of the overall investment performance represented by the IRR. Why would an investor want to do this type of performance attribution? Different property investment returns may lean more towards one of the components than the others, even if the overall IRR is the same. This can help in choosing between alternative investments. Because the motivations of investors differ, some investors may care more about one component of the IRR than another. Some investors may be more concerned with the cash flow they will receive immediately after having made the investment, while other investors may be more concerned with the long-term income potential of the property. Still other investors may be more concerned with the growth of the asset's value over the long term. Also, because the components are related to the sources or causes of the overall IRR, performance attribution can be helpful for diagnosing and analyzing multi-period investment performance. The IRR can be computed ex ante or ex post. Answer the following question to review your understanding of these two terms. Ex post, the IRR reflects the price paid for a real estate asset, the net cash flows earned over time, and the price the asset is currently valued at or was sold for. The IRR therefore indicates how well an investor performed in the following four basic functions of property-level real estate investment. Property selection. Finding a property that is not too expensive, that is priced at a going-in yield that isn't too high. Acquisition transaction execution, getting the deal done effectively, sometimes at a lower price. Operational management, that is, managing the property well while it is being held. Disposition or resale transaction execution, which includes finding a good buyer who will pay a high price, which equates to a low yield for the property. Property selection and acquisition transaction execution are particularly related to and reflected in the initial yield or IY component and the yield change or YC component. Operational management is particularly related to and reflected by the cash flow change or CFC and the yield change components. Disposition transaction execution is particularly related to and reflected by the yield change component. Performance attribution can be used as a diagnostic tool to identify your strengths and weaknesses when it comes to these functions, and to identify the source of returns. This may also be useful ex ante when considering a property investment. Do the major sources of its projected IRR align with your strengths and abilities as a property investor? Let's look at an example of parsing the IRR. Now let's walk through the mechanics of how we compute the IRR components. Let's continue with the simple numerical example of a multi-period property investment that we looked at previously. Recall that the IRR is calculated as 5.82% based on the initial capital cash flow, the operating cash flows, and the terminal capital cash flow. We now want to separate this IRR of 5.82% into its three major components. The first component of the IRR you have to identify is the initial yield. The initial yield is the cash flow yield earned during the first year of the investment based on the original amount paid for the investment. This is calculated by dividing the operating cash flow amount in year one of $50,000 by the investment amount in year zero of $1 million, which gives an initial yield of 5%. Your formula now looks as follows. Now assume that year 5's operating cash flows are projected to be $60,000. Based on this, the terminal yield of the asset is calculated as 5.76%. as you divide the cash flow of $60,000 by the resale price of the asset at the end of year 4, which, as you recall, is $1,041,012. You will use this information to calculate the cash flow change, which is the second component of the IRR. The cash flow change is the increment in the IRR relative to the initial yield caused purely by changes in cash flows. To compute this, we first compute what the IRR would be if the terminal yield remained constant. That is, what the IRR would be if the terminal capital cash flow reflected a yield of 5% instead of the actual terminal yield of 5.76%. This gives you a year 4 capital flow from resale of $1.2 million, which is 60,000 divided by 0.05, which would then provide the project with an IRR of 9.23%. The cash flow change component is now calculated by deducting the initial yield of 5% from the IRR you just calculated of 9.23%. This gives you a cash flow change component of 4.23%. This component is positive because the cash flow generally or overall grew from year 1 to year 5, even though it didn't grow every year. Your formula now looks as follows. The last component you have to identify is the yield change. Again, we want to measure the pure effect of just the yield change without any cash flow change. To do this, you first calculate what the IRR would have been if the operating cash flows remained constant, but the cash flow at the end of the period reflected the actual terminal yield of 5.76%. Thus, instead of the $1,041,012 capital cash flow or reversion in year 4, it would be $867,510, which is the $50,000 constant cash flow at the initial rate divided by the actual terminal yield of 5.76%. This gives you an IRR of 1.77%. The yield change component of the IRR is, again, only the incremental difference relative to the initial yield caused purely by the yield change, with cash flow held constant. So, we subtract our 5% initial yield from the 1.77% IRR we just computed. This gives you a yield change component of negative 3.23%. This is a negative percentage as the yield going into the investment is smaller than the yield at the end of the investment. The yield increased from 5% to 5.76%, implying a loss of value per dollar of income. Recall that price is inversely related to yield. Your IRR components formula now looks as follows. This approximately equals the actual total IRR of 5.82%. The slight difference of the actual IRR relative to the sum of the three components, here a negative 0.18%, is caused by the interaction of the three pure components together in the overall IRR. We refer to this as the interaction effect. It is usually small with typical property investments. In this video, you learned that the IRR of a real estate investment can often be largely parsed into three different components, namely initial yield, cash flow change, and yield change. By separating the IRR into these three components, you can determine which components contribute more towards the IRR of a specific investment. This information can be used to help evaluate and gain insight about the investment choices and an investor's performance. Reflecting on what you have learned in this video, how do you think IRR performance attribution can assist an investor in choosing between competing projects that will seemingly yield the same total IRR?